I would like to tell you a story. It is the story of a young boy by the name of Runyon Tine. Runyon considered himself something of an adventurer and spent most of his days wandering the fields of the large farm where he shared a rented house with his mother. Some days he would wander up and over the rolling hills behind his home, weaving through the shade of the tall trees covering the landscape. Other days, such as this day, he would stroll the lower fields, creating fanciful stories of battles and glory. His best memories were of days spent hiking the fields, seeking out enemies to vanquish and maidens to save. On this particular day, the sun was shining brightly overhead in the clear blue sky, filling the air with the sweet warmness of summer. Birds swooped lazily through that bright blue sky, and the green fields surrounded him, a gentle breeze bending the tall grass slightly over as he made his way towards the tree line in the distance, his trusty Rune sword in one hand. He called the sword Dragon's Tooth, and it was, in fact, nothing more than a length of wood carved down to a semblance of a point at one end, with a rough handle carved out on the other. But to Runyon, it was the finest blade in the realm. There was nothing of particular note about the sword, other than perchance the magic runes drawn in black marker up and down the blade, runes that were perhaps a bit more magical than Runyon realized. Occasional bull thistles with their large purple heads dotted the field and were perfect adversaries for the young adventurer who imagined them as goblins, trolls, ogres, and any number of other vile creatures. He had his eyes set on one such thistle, a particularly tall specimen with a fine purple head, the weight of which bent the stalk over slightly. A troll for certain, he thought to himself. He was slowly stalking along the edge of the wet, swampy area in the center of the field toward the troll, his sword whistling through the air as he swung it back and forth in anticipation of the battle to come. Normally, he would have avoided the swamp for fear of losing a shoe or worse, but not today. This was an enemy that could not be passed up. It should be noted that the swamp, while rather large and certainly wet and murky, did not pose much of a threat to the boy, other than sinking perhaps up to one knee in the smelly water, but he avoided it all the same. As he was drawing close to his prey, carefully placing each step, he heard a deep, rough voice call out, "A little help, please." He was so surprised that he almost dropped Dragon's Tooth into the murky water. He stopped in his tracks, quickly looking around for the source of the voice, but saw no one. Then, with a harumph, the voice came again. "Down here, a little help, please." Glancing down, the boy was so shocked at what he saw that he almost dropped his sword again. He rubbed his eyes with one fist. Sunk up to his chest in the swamp was what appeared to be a tiny man. The man's arms were crossed in front of him, resting on the firm ground at the edge of the swamp. He had a long, dark beard which strung out along the ground in front of him to keep dry, and bushy eyebrows over his brown, piercing eyes. On his head was a forest green cap. Most striking of all was the fact that he appeared to have two colorful fairy wings rising out of the water behind him. What are you?" Runyon stammered. The small man furrowed his eyebrows and replied, "Why, I'm a mountain troll come down to eat you up, of course." The boy's jaw dropped in amazement, and then the man added slightly louder and a bit more shrilly, "I'm a dwarf, you dolt. Now a little help, please." The boy, still somewhat in a state of shock, said, "But dwarfs don't have fairy wings." The dwarf, as he clearly was, sighed in frustration. "Boy, I could use a little help getting out of this swamp, if you have the time, of course." The boy, startled out of his shocked amazement, said, "Oh, yes, of course." Then he squatted down with Dragon's Tooth held out in front of him, one hand grasping each end. The dwarf quickly gripped the center of the stick, and Runyon slowly stood up, pulling back. With a thick, wet sucking sound, the swamp suddenly released the dwarf, causing the boy to tumble backward, stumbling and falling hard on the ground, knocking the air out of himself. The dwarf, still grasping the stick, followed, landing on top of him. With a humph, the dwarf pushed himself up off Runyon, fluttered his wings to dry them off, and began to stump around, muttering to himself about his hammer and where could it be. Runyon pushed himself up to his elbows, watching the dwarf in wonder, still not believing what his eyes were clearly showing him. With a whoop of triumph, the dwarf suddenly bent over, reaching and retrieving something from the ground. As the dwarf turned back toward him, Runyon could see the dwarf was grasping a large, heavy warhammer in both hands. Not a play stick, but a true warhammer. The boy, still unsure how to react, simply asked, "What was your hammer doing clear over there?" The dwarf shook his head in irritation and replied, "Why, I sent it off for help, of course, and it got tired about there and collapsed from exhaustion." The boy just gaped at the dwarf with a stunned look on his face. Seeing the boy's confusion, he slowly explained, "I tossed it over there to keep it from getting wet." Then he doffed his hat and bowed. "Dolan Stormhammer, at your service." The boy, not wanting to seem rude, quickly scrambled to his feet and bowed back to the dwarf. "Runyon Tine, at yours."